Okay then. Okay. Okay, hello. So we've reached the last podcast of the series. So this is a Wikipedia orientated podcast where we talk about wiki things with wiki people. So we've covered all kinds of topics, open license, open knowledge, education, wikis for children. We've covered the Cornish Wikipedia, the Spanish Wikipedia, and also the Irish Wikipedia. And today Simon Cobbs is going to have a chat with me regarding Wikidata, or Wikidata as we say here in Wales. So welcome, Simon.
Morning.
So Wikidata was launched on the 29th of October 2012. It has over 20,000 active viewers. And maybe the most edited Wikimedia project. But before we get into that, so Simon, can you just give us a bit of info about yourself and how you got involved with the wiki world?
Yeah, so I've been an editor for about 5 years now. I got into it when I was in Aberystwyth at library school, and I went to the National Library of Wales and asked if I can volunteer on their Wikimedia projects, and met Jason Evans, who's now National Wikimedian. And we've been working together ever since. I became the Wikidata visiting scholar at the National Library of Wales, and I've been working with them to get content from their collections into Wikidata. When I'm not editing Wikidata, I'm librarian who's working in research services at the University of Exeter. And that interest in research support has gone into Wikidata, and I'm very much involved in the Wiki site movement, which is building bibliographic data in Wikidata. So all sort of around librarianship still, but in my spare time.
So for people who have heard about Wikidata but don't really understand the concept, could you describe to us what it is and how it affects, Wikipedia and the other Wikimedia platforms?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we've just celebrated Wikidata's 8th birthday. It was created in 2012, and it was originally for collecting information from all of the Wikipedias and all of the Wikimedia projects, which would normally be updated individually in every language of Wikipedia, for example. So it's centralizing the storage of all of this information. And it's a knowledge base, which is similar to a database, but it's on a graph model rather than a table, tabular data model, which allows querying. And in addition to being a central storage place for all of this Wikimedia-related information, it's grown, and other organizations have started putting their content into it. And from that, the software has been released, Wikibases, and they're spreading as an ecosystem of from the centralized Wikidata. It's all growing out, so there's different nodes of information stored in different places, and it's all connected. So it's linked to open data. It's all about connecting information and being able to query it and reuse it. So centralized hub of open data is probably the succinct way of describing it.
So do you have to be an editor, a Wikipedia editor, to use Wikidata, or can you just maybe be a coder or maybe a data provider?
So I'm not really very active on Wikipedia, so I think that answers the question. No, you don't have to be a Wikipedia editor.
Yeah.
We have our own community, but there's also a crossover, and we work with all of the Wikipedias as well. You don't have to be particularly techie. You can just edit it through the interface. It's just as simple as entering a statement. The data is structured in triples. So, for example, my forename, Simon, so it's triples, so Simon Cobb as an entity, forename, Simon, and that's how all of the data is structured in those triples, subject, predicate, object. So it's machine readable, but human understandable semantic data. It sounds very complicated, but it's also very simple as well when you start to use it. Sorry, was there another question at the end there about?
No. Because I remember I find myself repeating myself every time in every podcast, really. And the Celtic Knots conference comes up in every podcast. And it's where I met you in, I think it was in Aberystwyth, or was it in Edinburgh?
I was in Edinburgh, but I don't know if we met there. I know we definitely met in Aberystwyth.
In Aberystwyth, okay. So I remember a presentation in Aberystwyth about Wikidata, and it's coming back to me in flashbacks, the key words, collaboration, multilingual, facts and references. So how important are these things, these elements to Wikidata?
So multilingual is really important because we can collect data in any language. And I know working with the National Library of Wales, because their collection is primarily in 2 languages, English and Welsh, it's really important for them to be able to use it in both languages. You don't have to have the same data entered twice, you just label it in English and in Welsh, and you can then pick and choose whether you want one language or the other. And then when you times that across 300 languages, it's incredibly useful to be able to just maintain one object with all of the different languages rather than having to do it multiple times for each language. That's a huge benefit for the whole Wikimedia ecosystem where there are many languages. In terms of the connectivity between items, yeah, it's just the nature of the beast, really. It's about linked open data. If you don't have the linkages, it's nothing. It's just a lot of isolated objects. But when you start getting the linkages, you can start learning from it and finding out information with your Sparkle queries, which is a query language, which is probably the most technical part of Wikidata. You do have to learn it to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember going over the Sparkle bits with Jason Evans when I was at the National Library maybe a few years ago. It can be quite complicated, really.
Yeah, I mean, I learned it from scratch, so it is possible to do it, but there's a lot of development work to try and create a user interface so you don't have to know that query language and you can just select things from drop-down menus to make it more accessible. There is a query builder as part of the Sparkle endpoint, and that's been developed continuously because Wikimedia Deutschland, who run it, the people who are involved in the project, recognize that this is a barrier to using the data. So there's a lot of user experience work and development work to try and improve that. I'm not sure how much it can be improved. There's obviously, if you know the query language, you can probably go further, but at least letting people get started without having to learn this scary coding language to begin with is a positive development there.
Because we've been doing, WiciMôn have been doing a lot of work with secondary school pupils, and especially the Welsh back, because it's for sixth form pupils, really, the Welsh back. And then they learn the skills of editing, how to put things on Wikipedia. And then it always comes up, the box, the info box.
Yeah.
So this goes back to Wikidata, doesn't it, really? And does it, or am I?
It's depending on which language Wikipedia you're using. I believe Welsh does. I wouldn't absolutely swear to that. In English, some do and some don't. It's been harder to get it adopted in the larger Wikipedias.
Why is that, though?
It's community resistance, I think. You mentioned earlier about references and how important they are. One of the main criticisms is Wikidata doesn't always have references for the data that it's sending into Wikipedias, and that's something that people would like to see to be able to validate the data. It's something that's been worked on both sides, and on the Wikipedia side, trying to make Wikidata editable from within that info box rather than having to transfer into Wikidata and start editing there. that would give the Wikipedia editors more control. And then on the Wikidata side, there's just ongoing work. And I mean, it's considered good practice to have references, but in a lot of cases, people import data and don't put a reference on every individual statement. You may have, in the case of an academic article, you may have a DOI which links to the original article, and you could consider that to be a way of validating the information, but it's just applied once within the item and not to every single piece of information. So it's just finding the right balance and continue to have a discussion with the Wikipedias and the Wikidata editors to find that sweet spot where everyone's happy.
So Wikidata is a sister project to Wikipedia in a way, isn't it? And
Yes.
It always comes up when I'm with the pupils, especially, like I said before, with the info boxes. Do you think, because I don't cover much of Wikidata in our sessions, do you think it's an important factor really to kind of maybe delve into Wikidata a bit more and maybe try and getting the pupils more aware of Wikidata and how to edit? Because it's quite easily to edit, isn't it?
It is quite easy to edit, and yeah, I think it's really important to start teaching people at a young age data literacy, because over the last few months, if you think about when you see the news, how much data is referred to in terms of the pandemic, it's just so important to be able to understand data yourself and not just rely on what someone else is telling you, but to be able to just have a look at it and analyze it a little bit and just understand that data itself, it doesn't really mean anything. It's what you then do with it to extract information. And I think it'd be really valuable to use Wikidata to just start building data literacy skills. It's quite an accessible way rather than trying to do an online course, for example, which is usually quite boring, whereas actively editing Wikidata about something that's relevant to you is quite engaging, I find at least.
Yeah. So what about young children then? Let's say primary school children. Do you think it's better that maybe older kids kind of, experiment on Wikidata, or is this something for every generation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I suppose any sort of educational exercise, it requires supervision of someone who's experienced. And I think if you've got that in place and you've got a mechanism to make sure that what the children are doing is correct, then I think that's absolutely fine. I'm not quite sure how that would work in the Wikimedia ecosystem, because everyone's meant to have their own account. So it does pose challenges. An alternative might be to set up a Wikibase, particularly for using for education, and put some data in that's relevant to the curriculum that the children are working on. So it's a private environment to do essentially the same thing. And as to get more experience, then you could start using the main Wikidata and letting them use data there, perhaps.
Okay. So how about maybe a 16, 17-year-old pupil who has maybe edited a lot of Wikipedia articles and want to maybe experiment a little bit with Wikidata? Where would they start? What would your advice be for someone who wants to start?
So it's a good question. I suppose best place to start would be to get a subset of data that they're interested in. I know when I was introduced to it at the National Library of Wales, it was working on entries from the Dictionary of Welsh Biography, and they were already in Wikidata, but not many of the people had dates of birth or dates of death. So it was just going to those existing items and reading through the articles in the biographies and extracting those dates and adding those. So working on a focused task like that, just to start to understand the way that the data is structured, is a really good way of learning. But if you go to the Wikidata homepage, there are links to tutorials and guides for doing different tasks on Wikidata, and that's a really good place to start as well. Also, the project chat to ask questions and get some advice from the community. It's a very friendly community, so I definitely encourage people to just ask their questions, not be shy.
So what's significant about the letter Q then? For
So
people
the
who
letter,
don't know.
so Q, it's I don't know why it's actually Q, but Q is an item in Wikidata as opposed to P, which is a property, L, which is a lexeme, or E, which is a schema. So I'm not sure where the original choice for Q came from, to be honest. I've never really thought about it. But
Yeah.
as you say, Q is a QID, I suppose, is the sort of slang term for it.
So every item starts with Q.
Yeah, and we've got 100 million of them now.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the future for Wikidata then? Because obviously it's all about data. So is there any kind of developments? Can it be developed, or is the groundings there established already?
I suppose the future for Wikidata is how it's reused, because I think it will continue to grow.
Yeah.
And the ecosystem of Wikibases, so that I mentioned earlier, so different institutions running their own kind of equivalent of Wikidata, I think that will all continue to grow. But it's how it's reused. Data, as I mentioned, isn't that useful until someone does something with it to make it informative. I think key developments will be the way that the data can be read by machines and converted into an article in Wikipedia automatically. For example, just a short starter article about a subject that no one has written about yet. It's going to be quite a key development as the technology in that area involves.
Yeah, you mentioned machines, and I'm having another flashback of the presentation, and I remember maybe a phrase "made for humans and machines." Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's human readable and machine readable. It's
Yeah.
what I was talking about earlier, those triples. It can be understood by a human when we talk about it. My name is Simon. Or, and it can also be understood by a machine. It's got that structure that a machine needs to understand it. Whereas a Wikipedia article is just paragraphs of text that a machine will really struggle to extract facts from. We're providing it in a format that a machine can read. And that's why it could then potentially make a Wikipedia article from all of these facts.
Okay. No, that's really interesting, really. So what are you working on at the moment? So what keeps you busy, Simon?
I'm working on many things. I've always got more to do than there are hours in the day. At the moment, I'm doing work on academic institutions and importing the missing faculties of universities, for example, of which there are many around the world. And the reason I've started working on that is because I've found it difficult to import employment information about researchers because we don't have the institute that they're employed at. So it's one piece of work that can facilitate another piece of work as it develops.
Oh, fantastic.
But this is all related to WikiCite. We've just had the conference this week, so I'm hoping to set up some workshops to get interested people together and focus on improving data quality for researchers.
So workshops targeting who? Young children, adults?
It will be primarily for people who are already Wikidata editors.
Right, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and it'll be a lot of librarians, but also looking for people from outside the community who are stakeholders in that area, who, for example, ORCID, we're reusing their data, and ORCID is an identifier. It's like a number which uniquely identifies a researcher, and it's also a really important source of data for Wikidata to harvest and use to enrich our own data. So trying to involve people from these partner institutions is an area I want to focus on, because Wikidata in isolation will continue to grow, but if we work with other people, it will continue to grow, and it will be good quality, and it will also have a more sustainable editor base, I think, if we've continued to talk to people rather than just try and do everything in isolation. So we've got all these conversations going on with the Wikipedia editors, with organizations who are donating data. And I think building all of these relationships is just going to be so important in the future.
Oh, brilliant. Fantastic. Oh, well, thanks very much for your time, Simon.
No, absolutely welcome.
Yeah,
Pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting chat. So to those who have been watching for the past, well, maybe 5 to 6 months, thank you for tuning in. And so the podcast will be on our Menter Iaith Môn YouTube channel. And of course, it'll be on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. So yeah, thank you, Simon, for your time, and maybe we'll catch up soon.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.